I've always been a laid-back person, the kind who likes to do things at my own pace, without worrying too much about what others think. But what happened that night on the train completely changed my perspective on safety and left a mark on me that I never thought possible. It was a Friday, and I had spent the entire day in the city, taking care of some errands. I was tired and just wanted to get home, wrap myself in a blanket, and forget about the outside world. I took the train back to the suburbs, using the Caltrain system that connects the San Francisco Bay Area, just like I had done so many times before. The trip was going to be long, about an hour and a half, and the car was almost empty. I sat by the window, put on my headphones, and tried to disconnect from the accumulated exhaustion of the day. Shortly after the train started moving, I noticed a man entering the car. He was visibly drunk, stumbling and mumbling to himself as he looked for a place to sit. At first, I tried not to pay attention, but I soon realized he was staring at me, as if deciding whether he should come closer. After a few minutes of hesitation, he finally got up and headed toward me. My heart started racing, and a feeling of discomfort began to grow. He sat in the seat next to mine, even though there were plenty of empty seats in the car. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the music playing in my headphones, but he started talking, interrupting my attempt to avoid the situation. "Hey, what's a pretty girl like you doing alone at this hour?" he slurred, his voice thick with alcohol. I gave a short reply, hoping he would take the hint, but he kept going. He started asking personal questions, wanting to know where I lived, if I had a boyfriend, and what I was doing in the city. With each question, I felt more and more uncomfortable, but I tried to stay calm, answering vaguely. Then he began leaning closer, his breath reeking of alcohol, and my discomfort turned into real fear. I politely asked him to back off, trying not to cause a scene, but he just smiled in a disturbing way and ignored my request. "Come on, I'm just trying to be friendly," he said, as he reached out to touch my arm. At that moment, panic took over me. I quickly got up and tried to move to another seat, but he grabbed my wrist, preventing me from getting away. "You don't need to run from me, I'm just starting to have fun," he murmured, his voice chilling me to the bone. Fortunately, a train guard entered the car at that exact moment. He immediately noticed the situation and came over to us. "Sir, let go of the young lady and sit back down," the guard ordered firmly. The man hesitated, but the guard's expression made it clear that he wasn't asking. Reluctantly, he let go of me and returned to his original seat, but not without giving me a threatening look that made my heart pound. The guard stayed in the car with me for the rest of the journey, ensuring the man didn't approach me again. Finally, my station arrived, and I got off the train, still shaking. I thanked the guard and made my way to the parking lot where my dad was waiting to pick me up. I told him what had happened, trying to hold back tears, and he was visibly worried. "That guy won't bother you anymore," he said, trying to calm me down. But little did I know, that nightmare was far from over. At that moment, I just wanted to forget the incident and move on. The next day, still shaken by what had happened, I decided to go out to clear my mind. I went to the grocery store with my dad, something we always did together on Saturday mornings. I was trying to distract myself, but the memory of that night was still fresh in my mind. We walked through the aisles, picking up what we needed, and I started to feel a bit more relaxed. But when we left the store and headed toward the car, I felt the blood freeze in my veins. There he was. The same man from the train, standing in the parking lot, leaning against a car with his arms crossed and a sinister smile on his face. He recognized me immediately and started walking toward us. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. My dad noticed my reaction and followed my gaze, quickly understanding what was happening. "Get in the car, now," he ordered, keeping calm, but with a tone of voice that I knew not to question. As I ran to the car, I heard the man shout something, but I couldn't make out the words. My dad sped away, and we left as fast as we could, without looking back. The drive home was silent, but the tension was palpable. When we got home, my dad assured me that the man wasn't a threat, but I knew he was just trying to comfort me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me, as if he had planned to meet me again. For the following weeks, I was in a constant state of alert. Every time I left the house, I felt like I was being watched, as if he could appear at any moment, anywhere. I could no longer take the train without feeling overwhelming panic, and even a trip to the grocery store became a terrifying task. The fear of running into him again was paralyzing, and I started avoiding going out alone, always asking someone to accompany me. The experience left me deeply shaken, and to this day, I can't forget the look in that man's eyes, the way he made me feel so vulnerable and helpless. It's as if he stole my sense of security, something I once took for granted. Although I haven't seen him since that day in the parking lot, the memory of his presence still haunts me, especially at night when I'm alone and my thoughts spiral out of control. I've shared this story with a few people, but many didn't understand the impact it had on me. They think it was just an isolated incident, something I should move on from and forget. But for me, it was much more than that. It was a chilling horror story that unfolded in my life, something that made me realize just how fragile the line is between normalcy and chaos. That man, who I barely knew, managed to instill a deep fear in me, something I never imagined I could feel. Now, every time I hear true horror stories, the kind that seem far removed from our reality, I remember that they can indeed become part of our lives. I was just a young woman heading home, not doing anything wrong, and yet I found myself in a situation that could have ended much worse. What happened to me is one of those terrifying horror stories that doesn't need ghosts or supernatural creatures to be frightening. All it takes is the malice and obsession of a human being to change a life forever. I've always enjoyed doing things on my own. Walking through the city streets, shopping, taking the train to visit friends. That day, I was on my way to my friend Sarah's house in a quiet neighborhood in Philadelphia. The afternoon was cold but pleasant, and I had just left a convenience store where I bought some snacks for the movie night we had planned. Everything seemed normal, but something changed when I noticed a man leaving the store right behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, we were in a big city, with people constantly on the move. But as I walked toward the train station, I began to notice that he was keeping a constant distance, always a few steps behind me. My intuition started to alert me, and a sense of discomfort settled in. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but every corner I turned, he turned as well. Every time I looked back, his eyes were fixed on me. I arrived at the train station a little earlier than scheduled, hoping to leave the discomfort behind. But what I feared came true. He entered the station too, maintaining his distance, but clearly watching my every move. It was as if he was studying my actions, waiting for the right moment to do something. My heart began to race, and my mind started to run through possibilities that I didn't want to consider but were impossible to ignore. As I waited for the train, I noticed something that made me even more nervous. He wasn't just following me, he was trying to take photos or videos of me with his phone, poorly disguising his movements. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I looked around for help, but the platform was almost empty. Time seemed to drag, and the train, which was usually on time, was late. Every minute that passed increased my anxiety. I tried to discreetly move away, changing places on the platform, but he kept watching me, now with a smile that caused me deep fear. I grabbed my phone and called Sarah, trying to keep my voice calm. I quickly explained what was happening, and luckily, she said she could come pick me up. I felt a small relief, but I knew I would still have to wait a few minutes before she arrived, and every second felt like an eternity. Then he started to approach, step by step, closing the distance between us. My heart was pounding uncontrollably, and I knew I was about to enter a dangerous situation. I tried to move away again, but he was quick, moving toward me with a terrifying determination. Fear took hold of me, and my mind was in panic. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. When he got close enough to try to grab my arm, something inside me woke up. I finally managed to scream for help, my voice echoing through the nearly deserted platform. It was the kind of scream you can't control, that comes from a deep, instinctive place. That scream caught the attention of a janitor who was working further down the platform. He immediately dropped what he was doing and ran toward me, realizing the danger. The man following me stopped abruptly, clearly scared by the possibility of being confronted. He looked at the janitor, then at me, and for a moment, I thought he might try something desperate. But seeing that the janitor was already close, he did the only thing he could. He turned and ran, disappearing through the station exit. I felt immediate relief, but my body was still trembling uncontrollably. I was in shock, struggling to understand what had just happened. The janitor helped calm me down and stayed with me until Sarah arrived. When she showed up, I ran into her arms, unable to hold back the tears. I told her everything that had happened, and she was horrified. We decided to go straight to the police to report the incident, but deep down, I knew the chances of finding that man were slim. He could be anywhere, maybe even watching, waiting for another opportunity. The thought filled me with dread. In the days that followed, the impact of what happened started to manifest in ways I didn't expect. Every time I left the house, I felt like I was being watched, as if he could appear at any moment, anywhere. I could no longer use public transportation without feeling overwhelming panic. I avoided being alone whenever possible, and even visits to Sarah's house became rare. It was as if a dark shadow had settled in my life, a constant presence of fear. This experience left a mark on me in a way I never imagined. To this day, I can't enter a train station without looking over my shoulder, without feeling that, at any moment, someone could be watching me, planning something. The memory of that man, of his predatory look, has never left me completely. And although I know he's probably moved on, the memory of what happened is still alive, a scar that will never fade. I decided to share this story because it's my way of dealing with the trauma, of trying to understand how something like this can happen so suddenly, on a day that started so normally. I never imagined I could be the target of someone like that, but it taught me that danger can be lurking anywhere, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. What happened to me is one of those real scary stories that make us realize just how fragile our sense of security is. Now, every time I hear true horror stories, the ones that seem almost impossible to believe, I remember that they're more real than we think. I lived through one of them. And no matter how much I try to move on, the fear is still there, a constant reminder that the world can be a terrifying place. And that, for me, is the true horror. I've never been the type to scare easily, but what happened to me that night completely changed my perception of safety. It was a Friday like any other, and I was waiting for my friend Josh in a cozy bar on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado. The night was cold, and the dim light of the place cast shadows that seemed to dance to the sound of low conversations and the clinking of glasses. I was relaxed, sipping a cocktail while checking messages on my phone, when a stranger approached and started talking to me. At first, he seemed harmless, the typical guy trying to be friendly. His name was Mark, and he had that friendly smile that makes you let your guard down. He asked if I was waiting for someone, and without thinking much, I said yes, that my friend was on his way. As soon as I mentioned it was a guy, the atmosphere between us changed. His smile became a bit more rigid, and his eyes, which had been carefree before, took on a disturbing intensity. I felt a little uncomfortable but tried not to show it. Mark started asking more personal questions, wanting to know details about my friend, where he lived, what he did. I answered vaguely, trying to hint that I wasn't interested in prolonging the conversation. However, he didn't seem to get the message. What had started as casual conversation was turning into some kind of interrogation. His insistence on knowing about Josh made me increasingly uneasy. I decided it was time to end the conversation and texted Josh, asking him to get there as soon as possible. A few minutes later, Josh finally arrived at the bar. When I saw him, I got up, relieved, and we greeted each other with a hug, hoping Mark would understand that his presence was no longer needed. He took a step back, still wearing that fake smile, and abruptly said goodbye. The encounter left me with a strange feeling, as if something wasn't right, but I tried to ignore it and focus on the evening with my friend. Josh and I spent another hour there, talking and laughing, until we decided it was time to go home. As we walked to the train station, I couldn't stop thinking about Mark's look. There was something about him that wouldn't leave me alone. However, I tried to push those thoughts aside, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, how many scary stories start with a casual encounter that ends up being nothing, right? But fate seemed to have other plans for me that night. When I got to the station, I said goodbye to Josh, who lived in the opposite direction, and went down the stairs to the platform. The station was practically deserted, except for one or two lonely passengers. While waiting for the train, I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around, and my heart nearly stopped. Mark was there, standing at the other end of the platform, staring at me intently. The smile was gone, replaced by a blank, threatening expression. It was like he was hunting me. I froze for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. The station was silent, and the only sound was the wind cutting through the tunnel. I knew I needed to get out of there, but the next train was still a few minutes away. I tried to act indifferent, turned my back, and pretended to be focused on my phone, but I could feel his eyes glued to me. Every second seemed to drag on, and panic began to set in. My hands were sweating, and my heart was pounding so hard I feared he could hear it. Finally, the train arrived, and I quickly got on, positioning myself near the door to get out as soon as possible at my station. But to my horror, Mark got on the same car, sitting a few seats away. He didn't take his eyes off me. At every stop, I hoped he would get off, but he stayed there, like a sinister shadow. What had once seemed like a bizarre coincidence was now turning into something much more threatening. I arrived at my stop, which was in a relatively isolated part of the city. I got off the train quickly, but I noticed that Mark did the same. He started following me, keeping a distance just close enough not to raise immediate suspicion, but close enough to make me feel constantly in danger. I needed to think fast. I grabbed my phone and called my roommate, Michael, desperately asking him to meet me at the station. Luckily, he was home and said he would be there in a few minutes. While I waited, I tried to stay calm, but the panic was overwhelming me. Mark began to pick up his pace, closing the distance between us. He started whispering something that I couldn't quite make out, but his words had a menacing tone. He demanded that I take him to my house. My heart was racing, and I knew I needed to act. I ran toward the station exit, hoping to find someone who could help me. When I finally spotted Michael, it was like a wave of relief washed over me. He ran toward me, and when Mark saw I wasn't alone, he hesitated for a moment. Michael asked what was going on, and before I could answer, Mark turned and ran off, disappearing into the darkness of the night. I was shaking, and Michael hugged me, trying to calm me down. We went straight home, where I finally felt safe enough to breathe, but that night left a lasting impact on me. After that incident, I started to realize that not all true scary stories happen only in movies or books. Sometimes, they're closer than we think, hidden in the shadows of our everyday lives. Since then, I've never been able to wait alone in a public place without feeling like someone might be watching me. That casual encounter at a bar turned into a real nightmare, a true horror story that still haunts me to this day. Maybe I'll never know what Mark really wanted or how far he would have gone if Michael hadn't shown up at the station. But what I do know is that since that night, my life has never been the same. Now, whenever I hear scary stories, I can't help but think that it could happen to me again. Reality can be far more terrifying than any fiction. And what happened to me is living proof of that. I've always been a reserved person, someone who preferred to go unnoticed in a crowd. Maybe that's why what happened that night affected me so much. It was a cold Thursday in November, and I was waiting for the train at the Fullerton station in Chicago. The station was practically deserted, except for a few passengers who, like me, seemed exhausted. While I waited, lost in my thoughts, a man approached. He had a strange, unkempt appearance, and his eyes stared at me in a way that made me uncomfortable from the very first moment. At first, I tried not to pay much attention. I thought he might just be another one of the many peculiar passengers you encounter in a big city like Chicago. But as the minutes passed, he kept staring at me in a way that made me feel exposed, as if he were analyzing every detail of me. He approached slowly, as if calculating each step. When he finally got close enough, he started asking personal questions. "Do you live around here?" he asked, with a slow, dragging voice. I tried to be polite but gave short answers, hoping he would understand that I wasn't interested in talking. However, he didn't seem to get the message. In fact, he seemed to feed off my discomfort. With each of my answers, he became more insistent. "What's your name? Are you waiting for someone? Can I get your phone number?" When he asked that last question, a shiver ran down my spine. I felt that something was terribly wrong. Realizing that he wouldn't give up easily, I decided to give him a fake number. I thought this would make him lose interest and leave me alone. But as soon as he tried calling the number in front of me and realized it was fake, his expression changed completely. What had been an insistent look now turned into anger. He started staring at me with an intensity that made my heart race. Without saying a word, he began following me around the station, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. I could feel his presence right behind me, and my panic grew with every second. My mind raced, trying to find a way out. The station was small, with not many places to hide or people to ask for help. But then I saw a janitor on the other side of the platform. He was cleaning the floor, oblivious to what was happening. I gathered all the courage I had left and ran to him, asking for help. I quickly explained the situation, and the janitor, noticing my desperation, intervened. The strange man hesitated for a moment, as if evaluating whether it was worth continuing to follow me, but then he turned and ran off, disappearing into the night. I stayed there, trying to catch my breath, still in shock from what had just happened. The janitor walked me to the train, making sure I was safe. I couldn't stop shaking, even after sitting down in the car. I tried to convince myself that the worst was over, that I was safe now. However, the real nightmare began the next day. When I woke up, I found several new messages on my Instagram. They were all from an anonymous account, with no profile picture, and the messages were disturbing. "Did you think you could get away from me? And I know where you live," were some of the things he wrote. My heart sank as I realized that, somehow, he had found my profile. I didn't know how, but he managed to find me online. The panic I had felt at the station returned with full force. I immediately went to the Chicago police, but they said that without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do besides file a report. That didn't bring me any comfort. I felt vulnerable, as if he could show up at any moment. Not knowing what else to do, I deleted my Instagram account and created a new one, using a fake name. I also changed my phone number, hoping to cut off any communication with him. For a few days, I managed to maintain some peace, but the fear never completely went away. I avoided leaving the house alone and was always alert, expecting to see that familiar, terrifying face around every corner. Time passed, and the messages stopped, but the trauma remained. I could never again use public transportation without feeling that cold chill down my spine, that sense that I was being watched. Even in the comfort of my own room, I felt exposed, as if he were watching me from afar, waiting for the right moment to strike again. This encounter made me realize how fragile we are and how true horror stories can happen to anyone, at any time. It doesn't matter how careful I am, the fear that something like this could happen again will always be present. What started as an ordinary night at a train station turned into a chilling horror story that still haunts me. I can't help but think of the scary real stories I've heard throughout my life and how now I'm part of one of them. The experience taught me to be more cautious, but it also left a mark on me that I'll never be able to forget. Even today, when I tell this story to someone, I see the disbelief in their eyes, as if it's hard to believe that something so terrifying could happen in real life. But I know the truth. I lived that truth. And now, I'm sharing this account in the hope that others can learn from my experience and protect themselves better. Maybe by telling this story, I can finally start to overcome the fear that still consumes me. But one thing is certain, I will never underestimate the power of everyday terror, the kind that arises in the most mundane situations and can change our lives forever. If there's one thing this story has taught me, it's that evil can hide anywhere, just waiting for the right opportunity to reveal itself. And that's why, whenever I hear scary stories, I know they're more real than we'd like to admit. I've worked for the CTA, Chicago's public transportation system, for over 20 years. In that time, I've seen it all: rats the size of cats, bizarre passengers, scenes that look like they're straight out of horror movies. But despite everything, I always kept my composure, trying not to be fazed by the strange events. After all, it's Chicago, right? If you work in the subway, you learn quickly to ignore the unusual. But that night, something happened that made me question everything. Something that still gives me chills just thinking about it. It was a typical autumn night, and I was on duty at one of the oldest and least busy stations in the system, the 63rd Street station on the Red Line. The station was practically deserted, except for a few workers here and there. It was one of those nights when you feel that the silence is dense, almost tangible. I was in charge of a routine inspection, checking the tracks and lighting. The work was tedious but necessary, and I was already used to the solitude that came with it. As I walked along the platform, I heard a strange sound coming from inside the tunnel. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own footsteps or the noise of some rodent running along the tracks. But the sound persisted, and soon I realized it was different from anything I had heard there before. It was something between a low moan and a whisper, almost as if someone was trying to speak but didn't want to be heard. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to identify the source of that sound. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. I decided to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I continued my work, checking the lights along the platform. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a child's voice, weak, calling for help. It was a soft voice, almost drowned out by the distant sound of a train, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The sound was coming from the tunnel, where no child should be. A chill ran down my spine, but my first reaction was logical: some lost child, maybe. I needed to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the tunnel entrance. The darkness inside was almost absolute, and the air was heavy with the smell of oil and old dust. I called out to the child, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. I walked a few steps into the tunnel, shining the flashlight into every corner. Then, as I rounded a curve, I saw something I will never forget: a small silhouette, clearly of a child, standing in the middle of the tracks. They were motionless, looking in my direction, but something was very wrong. The flashlight shook in my hand as I tried to see better. The light revealed details that terrified me even more. The child was wearing old-fashioned clothes, something that looked like it came from a time long past. But what really paralyzed me was the shadow next to them. It was the shadow of an adult, but there was no one there. The man's silhouette seemed to project from the tunnel wall, like a ghostly presence. My heart raced, and for a moment, I was completely still, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The child's voice called for help again, but now it sounded distorted, as if it was coming from a distant, unreal place. The shadow next to the child seemed to move, although nothing else was moving in that tunnel. It was as if the air itself was alive, pulsing around them. I knew I needed to get out of there, but my feet felt glued to the ground. The sense of dread kept growing until I finally forced myself to take a step back. With my heart in my throat, I started running toward the platform. When I finally reached the light of the station, I was out of breath, sweat running down my face. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold the radio to call the police. I explained what I had seen, but I knew my story would sound absurd to anyone who heard it. Still, the police arrived quickly, and soon we were all back in the tunnel, looking for the child I had seen. One of the police officers' flashlights found something on the ground, a few yards from where I had stopped before. It was a small child's shoe, dirty and worn by time, as if it had been there for years. But there was no sign of the child or the shadow. The police searched for over an hour, exploring every corner of that cursed tunnel, but they found nothing except that shoe. They tried to reassure me, saying it must have been a trick of the light, or maybe some vagrant who escaped before they arrived. But I knew what I had seen. And it wasn't anything natural. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened. Did I really see a child being used as bait by some psychopath? Or was there something even more sinister happening in those dark subway depths? The true horror stories I had heard over the years hadn't prepared me for the reality I faced that night. I knew I would never look at those tunnels the same way again. The CTA never officially confirmed what happened. They claimed the child was probably lost and was found later, but I never believed that version. The image of that shadow, hovering beside the child, still haunts me. Sometimes, on lonely night shifts, I think I hear that child's voice again, echoing from the tunnel's depths. And every time that happens, I feel the same cold fear I felt that night. That encounter changed me. After that incident, I started paying more attention to the scary real stories that circulate among subway workers. Many of them seem far-fetched, but now, I know that some are painfully true. What happened in that tunnel was just one of many terrifying horror stories that never reach the public. And maybe it's better that way. Some truths are simply too frightening to be told. I still work for the CTA, but with a new perspective. The Chicago subway has dark secrets, and some of them should never be uncovered. I try to focus on my work, but on nights like this, when the station silence is broken by inexplicable noises, I remember that child and the forgotten shoe. And I realize that no matter how hard we try to ignore it, evil can hide anywhere, even in the places we think we know so well. This is one of the true horror stories I will never forget. It showed me that the unexplainable is always lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And even if we try to forget, the fear remains. Because deep down, we all know that some scary stories aren't just tales to frighten us. They're real, and they can happen to any of us. I've always loved the idea of exploring New York on my own, especially when it came to watching a movie at the theater, something I did whenever I wanted to escape from my routine. It was a Friday night, and I was excited to see the new movie that had just come out. I took the subway at the 14th Street station, as usual, with my headphones on, listening to my favorite music while watching the city lights flash by the train window. Everything seemed normal until I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that a man, sitting a few seats ahead, wouldn't stop staring at me. He was older, probably in his 40s, with a hard expression that made me immediately uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that he would soon lose interest, but that didn't happen. Every time I looked up, there were his eyes, fixed on me, as if he were analyzing me, studying my every move. The sense of unease began to settle in. When the train reached my station, Union Square, I got up quickly, hoping he wouldn't do the same. But to my dismay, he stood up too. My heart began to race, and I knew I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I walked through the train doors and started heading toward the stairs leading to the surface. I could feel his footsteps behind me, matching my pace, as if he was determined to follow me. The crowd around me offered a bit of comfort, but I knew I had to think fast. When I reached the top of the stairs, I tried to shake him off by abruptly turning left and entering one of the station's shops. I pretended to be interested in something in the window, but my eyes were focused on the reflection in the glass, monitoring his every move. He walked past me but then stopped, turning his head as if he knew I was trying to avoid him. My stomach churned when I saw that he was determined to find me. It wasn't just a coincidence. He was really stalking me. I decided to leave the shop and keep walking, this time with quicker steps, blending into the crowd in the hope that he would lose my trail. But once again, he appeared, now only a few yards away. I could feel the panic rising inside me, and every fiber of my being was screaming for me to run, but something was holding me back. It was as if I was frozen with fear, unable to think clearly. He got closer, finally reaching out and grabbing my arm. His touch was cold, his voice low and threatening. "Hey, give me your phone number," he said, as if it was a demand, not a request. I tried to pull my arm away, but he tightened his grip, forcing me to look into his eyes. "I just want to talk," he insisted, but there was nothing friendly about his tone. I said no, that I was in a hurry, but he kept holding on to me, as if he wasn't going to let me go until he got what he wanted. My heart was pounding, and I knew I had to get out of there before things got worse. I looked around, desperately searching for someone who could help me, but no one seemed to notice what was happening. I decided to lie, giving him a fake number, hoping that would be enough for him to let go of me. However, he didn't seem convinced. "Show me your screen," he demanded, trying to grab my phone to check if I was telling the truth. At that moment, I managed to muster the courage I had left and yanked my arm away with all my strength, finally freeing myself from his grip. Without thinking twice, I started running toward the station exit, pushing my way through the crowd. He shouted something, but I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own heart beating in my ears. I ran to the surface, blending into the crowd that filled the New York streets that night. Fortunately, I managed to lose him among the people, and eventually, he gave up following me. I stayed there, panting, hiding in the entrance of a store, trying to process what had just happened. The adrenaline was still coursing through my body, and tears started streaming down my face as I tried to pull myself together. I had never felt so scared in my life, and the thought that this man might still be looking for me terrified me. The experience left a mark on me in a way I never could have imagined. The simple act of taking the subway, something I did almost every day, had now become a frightening task. I avoided going out alone at night as much as possible, always worried about seeing that familiar face somewhere, ready to grab me again. It was as if a shadow had settled over my life, a constant feeling that something bad could happen at any moment. I shared the story with a few friends, but, as expected, many didn't believe something like this could have been so terrifying. They told me I was overreacting, that maybe he was just being persistent. But I knew the truth. I felt the malice in that situation, in the way he looked at me, how he touched me. That man didn't have good intentions, and the fact that he followed me through the station and grabbed me was proof enough that something terrible could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. This experience showed me that horror can arise in the most ordinary situations and that the true scary stories we hear from others are, in fact, possible. New York is a vibrant city, full of life, but it also hides its own horrors. And that night, I was confronted by one of them. Today, every time I enter a subway station, I feel a shiver down my spine, as if I'm waiting for that man to appear out of nowhere, ready to grab me again. I never saw him again, and I hope I never do. But the fear remains. It's as if he left an invisible mark on me, a constant reminder that evil can be lurking anywhere, at any time. This is one of the true horror stories I carry with me, and no matter how much I try to forget it, I know it will always be there, in the back of my mind, ready to remind me of how vulnerable we can be. Sharing this story is my way of dealing with the trauma, of trying to exorcise the demons that still haunt me. I hope that by hearing this story, others can understand that danger can be around any corner and that we always need to be vigilant. Because, in the end, the scary stories aren't just in movies or books. They can be part of our reality if we're not careful. When I was younger, I had a passion for dangerous adventures. I always loved the adrenaline, the risk that came with these experiences. I was the kind of person who would hike unmarked trails, swim in rivers with strong currents, and once, I even jumped off a cliff just to feel that stomach-churning thrill I craved. But over time, these adventures were left behind, replaced by adult responsibilities. Until recently, I found myself with an uncontrollable desire to relive one of those thrilling experiences. I had read about the practice of hopping on moving trains, something many would consider crazy, but to me, it seemed like the perfect combination of nostalgia and adrenaline. I knew it was illegal and dangerous, but that was exactly the kind of challenge I was looking for. I chose an isolated train line in the outskirts of Los Angeles, on the Union Pacific Line. The line passed through a long, dark tunnel, a place that somehow attracted me even more. I parked my car a few miles from the tunnel, where I knew I wouldn't be disturbed. The plan was simple. I would jump on one of the freight trains, ride through the tunnel, and then walk back to the car. The night was cold, and the silence around was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the wind through the trees. There was something unsettling about the atmosphere, but I ignored the feeling, convinced it was just pre-adventure nerves. The moment to jump on the train came faster than I expected. When I saw it approaching, my heart raced, and a mix of excitement and fear took over me. I managed to grab one of the side ladders and, with some effort, pulled myself up, feeling the cold wind on my face as the train moved along the tracks. Everything was going according to plan, and I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. When the train entered the tunnel, I was immediately engulfed by darkness. The only light came from the small openings in the tunnel ceiling, creating a play of shadows that danced around me. That's when I started to feel something strange. It was as if there was a presence there, something that shouldn't be. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I soon realized I wasn't alone in that tunnel. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my arm, something that felt like a hand trying to grab me. I instinctively turned around, but there was no one there. The fear started growing inside me, something primal, that I hadn't felt since childhood. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the touch came back, this time stronger, as if it was trying to pull me off the train. Panic took over me, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I climbed down from the train as quickly as I could, almost falling onto the tracks as the metallic sound of the wheels echoed through the tunnel walls. As I moved away from the train, I looked back and saw something that froze me to the core. Inside the tunnel, in the shadows that now seemed thicker, I saw strange silhouettes, dark figures moving erratically, as if they were watching and waiting. It was hard to tell what they were, but there was something undeniably malevolent about them. I started running, my footsteps echoing through the tunnel like the beat of drums, getting faster and more desperate. It was dark, but I could feel the presence of the silhouettes closing in, as if they were chasing me. The sensation of invisible hands trying to grab me continued, now accompanied by distorted whispers that were barely understandable. The only thing clear was the feeling of imminent danger, something I had never experienced with such intensity. When I finally emerged from the tunnel, the cold night air hit my face like a wave of relief. I looked back, expecting to see the silhouettes emerging from the shadows, but all I saw was the darkness of the tunnel. However, the relief was short-lived. From the depths of the tunnel, I heard a scream. A long, desperate scream that reverberated through the night air, making my blood run cold. It was the sound of pure terror, something that couldn't be human, yet it seemed filled with pain and suffering. The scream paralyzed me for a few seconds, unable to move or even think. My survival instinct finally kicked in, and I started running as fast as my legs would carry me. The way back to my car seemed endless, and the feeling of being watched persisted, as if those silhouettes were still chasing me, even outside the tunnel. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, where I got in and locked the doors with trembling hands. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could, the scream still echoing in my mind. I drove for miles without looking back, as if something could be following me down the deserted road. Only when I reached the safety of the city did I finally allow myself to breathe, but the feeling of fear persisted for days. Whatever was in that tunnel, it wasn't something from this world, and I knew I would never be able to forget that experience. I decided that I would never try anything like that again. The adrenaline that I once sought now repelled me. That experience changed my perception of adventure and made me realize that there are places and situations that should not be explored. What happened that night was more than just a scare, it was an encounter with the unexplainable, something that made me understand that some true horror stories are more real than we would like to believe. Since that day, I avoid talking about what happened, afraid of reliving the terror I felt. But there are moments when, at night, when I'm alone, I still hear that scream in my mind, and the sensation of invisible hands trying to pull me back returns, making me question what really happened in that tunnel. I don't know if I'll ever be able to completely overcome it, but one thing is certain, I will never again attempt to challenge the unknown in that way. This is one of those scary stories that leave a mark on your soul, a constant reminder that there are forces we don't understand and that it's better not to provoke them. What I encountered in that tunnel wasn't something I could fight or rationalize, and that's what makes this experience even more disturbing. Because deep down, we all know that there are things that simply can't be explained, and that truth can be more terrifying than anything else. If you enjoyed these horror stories, you can't miss the case that haunts me, True Disturbing Police Horror Stories, Creepypasta. To watch, click on the video in the card here or look for the video that came before this one on the channel. And, of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you've had a paranormal experience too. Stay brave, and see you in the next scary story.